Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Ozcast.
Okay, so get this, right? It's the third anniversary of, the whole Russia-Ukraine thing.
Yeah.
And things are getting, really tense over at the UN,
Right.
You sent this article. It's from AP News, came out, just today, February 24th, 2025. And it's about way more than just some meeting, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's dueling resolutions and, people are talking about backroom deals and pressure, and everybody wants to know, what is the U.S. even doing?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating situation that's developing.
So, ready to untangle this whole mess?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, so we've got the UN General Assembly. They're meeting to try and, deal with this whole ongoing war.
Right.
But there are two completely different resolutions on the table,
Yeah.
and each one's got some serious backing.
That's right.
So on one side, you've got Ukraine and the European Union, and their resolution is pretty much, Russia, get out now.
Straightforward.
But then there's the U.S. resolution, and it's surprisingly quiet about, Russia actually being the aggressor here. It just focuses on a quick, peaceful end to the conflict. No blame, really.
A very curious approach, and it's leading a lot of people to wonder, is this a sign that the U.S. is, maybe trying to appease Russia?
It's definitely raising eyebrows.
It is.
Oh.
It is, and all around the world, too.
Especially because, we're hearing from sources that the U.S. actually pressured Ukraine pretty hard to drop their own resolution and just get behind the U.S. version. What do you think about that?
I mean, that...
And get this, Ukraine said, no way.
Wow, that's a bold move. It really shows how much tension there is between them, even though they're supposed to be allies, right?
Yeah, you got to wonder what's behind this whole U.S. push for such a fast resolution.
Yeah, what is the motivation?
Well, this article points to Trump, right?
Okay.
He's been pushing for these direct talks with Russia, wants to end the conflict ASAP, it seems. But here's the thing that's really causing a stir. Apparently, Europe and Ukraine, they were totally left out of those early talks.
Really? Just completely excluded.
Yeah, so, that just throws gasoline on the fire. Because on top of that, Trump hasn't exactly been, diplomatic in how he's talking about Zelensky.
Right, what has he been saying?
Oh, man, he's called him a dictator.
Wow.
Accused Ukraine of starting the whole thing. Even warned Zelensky, get to the negotiating table or you'll lose your whole country.
That's some pretty strong language.
It is. So, that on top of this new resolution that's downplaying Russia's role, people are getting nervous about whether the U.S. really has Ukraine's back anymore.
Yeah, I can see why.
So how's Zelensky taking all of this? What's his response?
Well, he's not staying silent, that's for sure.
Okay, good.
He's firing back, accusing Trump of basically falling for Russian propaganda.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's a public fight now, which is definitely adding to the drama at the UN.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got these two resolutions, totally different, right? And the U.S. and Ukraine are at odds. But where does this go from here? What's the UN going to do?
So the U.S. wants their resolution to go to the Security Council.
Okay.
Which, at first glance, sounds like a power move.
Right.
But there's a catch. Russia has veto power in the Security Council.
Ah, so they can just shut it down. So what's the point then?
Exactly. That's the question.
If the U.S. knows that, is this really about trying to find a resolution, or is something else going on?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
What is their end game?
And then there's Ukraine's resolution.
Right.
That one's headed to the General Assembly for a vote.
Okay.
And, okay, sure, their resolutions aren't, legally binding or anything.
Right.
But they still matter a lot in terms of global opinion. It's like the whole world is watching to see who's on whose side,
Exactly. Who gets the most likes on their post. And it's important to remember, the General Assembly already condemned Russia's invasion, 6 times.
Wow.
Yeah, and they've demanded the troops withdraw every time. So there's a history here of taking a strong stance against Russia.
Which makes the U.S. approach even more strange, don't you think?
It does raise some questions about their strategy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're going against what most of the world thinks. Okay, let's get into the details of these resolutions.
Okay.
What stands out to you about the Ukrainian version? Like, what are they saying?
Well, they don't hold back at all. They directly call out Russia's aggression,
Okay.
talk about the specific territories Russia violated.
Right.
They even accuse them of war crimes and point to North Korean troops fighting alongside the Russians.
Wow.
It's very direct.
Okay, that's
And-
intense. What about the U.S. resolution? How does it compare?
It's surprisingly short.
Really?
And like we said, avoid saying that Russia's the aggressor at all. They basically just talk about the tragic loss of life and the need for things to end quickly.
So it's like they're speaking two completely different languages.
Exactly. And that difference is really at the heart of this whole diplomatic puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah.
What does it tell us about the U.S.'s role in this? Is it a strategy, a big mistake, or something else entirely?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. I mean, the U.S. has been a major ally to Ukraine, right?
Right.
They've given billions in aid, which Ukraine really needed to defend itself.
Yeah, absolutely essential.
But now, with this UN approach and all of Trump's talk, people are nervous, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe, too.
Yeah, because it's creating this doubt about the U.S. commitment. And that has huge implications for, the whole transatlantic alliance, which has been so important for Western security for, decades.
Right. So if the U.S. starts backing away, does that mean Europe has to step up and do more for Ukraine?
It's definitely a possibility, but it's not that simple. I mean, Europe isn't one big entity with a single voice. There are different opinions within the EU about how to handle this.
Right, of course.
Some countries want to get tougher with Russia. Others are more cautious.
And a divided Europe, well, that's exactly what Putin wants, right?
And divide and conquer. Not good.
Not good at
A
all.
weak transatlantic alliance would be a huge win for Russia and could have really serious consequences for everyone's security.
Okay, so we've talked about how a quick resolution might not be the best thing, especially if it means sacrificing Ukraine's safety and weakening the U.S.-Europe bond. But what's the other option then? What does the Ukrainian resolution actually offer?
The resolution lays out a pretty clear path. Russia withdraws all their troops, respects Ukraine's borders and independence, and faces the consequences for what they've done.
Okay.
It basically matches what most of the world agrees on for a just solution.
But realistically, do you think Putin is just going to back down at this point?
It's definitely a long shot. But the fact that so many countries support Ukraine's position, it shows a strong global commitment to upholding international law and holding aggressors accountable.
Yeah, that's a good point. This is all super interesting on that global level.
Right.
But let's bring it down to earth for a second.
Okay.
Why should the average person even care about this diplomatic back and forth at the UN?
Because this isn't just about Ukraine, right? This conflict has ripple effects. It reaches way beyond their borders.
Okay.
It's a challenge to the fundamental principles of international order, the rule of law, and the right of nations to decide their own future.
It's a reminder that even stuff that seems far away can have a big impact on our lives and the future of the world, really.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to go beyond just the headlines, to really understand the complexity, the nuances, and to have real discussions about what's at stake.
And that's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive, right? Dig a little deeper.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the resolutions, the players, the possible consequences.
Yeah.
But to really grasp what's happening, I think we need to step back in time a bit, look at the history of U.S.-Russia relations.
You're absolutely right. That historical context is crucial for understanding where we are today.
Okay, so let's do that.
Let's go back in time.
What are some of the key moments that have shaped the relationship between these two superpowers?
Well, the roots of this rivalry, they go way back to the Cold War.
Oh, wow.
When the U.S. and the Soviet Union were locked in this global struggle, capitalism versus communism.
Yeah, that was a tense time. A lot of mistrust and the threat of nuclear war constantly hanging over everyone.
Exactly. Incredibly tense and mistrustful. And even though the Cold War officially ended in the early 1990s, a lot of those underlying tensions, they never really went away.
So even though the Soviet Union collapsed, the rivalry just kept going.
It didn't completely disappear, no.
Ah.
And in recent years, especially under Putin, we've seen those tensions flare up again. Think about Russia taking Crimea in 2014.
Right.
They're meddling in the 2016 U.S. election.
Right.
And their constant support for those separatists in eastern Ukraine. All of that shows a relationship that's been full of challenges.
So this conflict in Ukraine is really just the latest chapter in a very long and very complicated story.
Exactly.
And understanding that history is key to making sense of what's happening now and figuring out how to move forward.
Exactly.
So what can we learn from that history? Are there any patterns or insights that might help us navigate this current crisis?
One of the biggest takeaways from the Cold War is that communication and diplomacy, no matter how difficult they are absolutely essential.
Okay.
There were so many times when the U.S. and the Soviet Union came incredibly close to nuclear war, but they always managed to step back from the brink through talking and negotiating.
So even with all that rivalry, they still knew they had to talk to each other.
Absolutely.
Huh.
That's such an important lesson for us today,
Yeah.
Even with the current tension, the U.S. and Russia need to keep talking, keep searching for diplomatic solutions to this crisis in Ukraine.
That makes sense, but is that even possible? With all the mistrust, can they actually find common ground?
It's a huge challenge, definitely. But history shows us that even the worst enemies can cooperate when they realize it's in their best interest.
Well, let's hope that's the case here. We've covered a lot today. It's clear this U.S.-Ukraine tension at the UN is just one piece of this big puzzle with a lot of history and complex factors at play. Maybe we should take a moment to digest all this and then...
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
come back and look at those domestic political factors you mentioned.
That sounds like a great plan.
Because those internal pressures, they often get overlooked, but they play a huge role in shaping how countries act on the world stage.
Absolutely, they do.
So stay tuned, everyone. We'll be back in a bit to dive into how politics in both the U.S. and Russia might be influencing this whole situation.
Looking forward to it. All right, so before we jump into those domestic political pressures, maybe a quick recap for our listeners.
Yeah, good idea.
We're looking at this clash at the UN, right? All about the war in Ukraine. 2 resolutions, one from Ukraine and the EU, and then the U.S. has their own totally different approach.
Right, and this is all happening while things between the U.S. and Ukraine are getting, well, kind of tense.
Yeah.
Trump wants a quick resolution, but he's also making some interesting comments about Zelensky, to say the least.
Right, and that's where those internal political pressures we talked about really come into play.
Okay.
You can have a huge impact on how a country acts on the world stage.
So let's start with the U.S. side of things.
Okay.
What's going on domestically that might be influencing Trump's approach to this whole conflict? I mean, he's got to be thinking about re-election next year, right?
Absolutely, that's a big factor. Some analysts think he's trying to look strong on the international stage, appeal to voters who want a decisive leader, especially when it comes to foreign policy.
So a quick resolution, even if it means concessions, it might look like a win for him politically.
That's one way to see it. It could be spun as, taking charge, ending a war that's costing money and isn't popular.
But, like we discussed, rushing into a resolution could have serious long-term consequences, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole region.
Exactly. It shows how tricky it is to balance short-term political gains with long-term strategic thinking in foreign policy.
It's a tough situation, that's for sure. So what about Russia, then? What's going on their side? Putin's facing his own set of internal pressures, right?
That's right, even though it seems like he has this, iron grip on power.
Yeah, I always assumed he was pretty much untouchable.
Well, the reality is the Russian economy is struggling, partly because of those Western sanctions after they took Crimea.
Right.
That's hurting ordinary Russians, leading to some discontent.
Okay.
And then there's the issue of corruption, which has been a problem in Russia for a long time.
So even though he controls things tightly, he's not immune to domestic pressure.
No leader truly is. And some experts believe that Putin might be using this conflict in Ukraine to distract from those internal problems.
Oh, interesting. So he's kind of rallying people around the flag, making it about, us versus the West to take their minds off other stuff.
That's a strategy leaders have used throughout history. It creates a sense of unity, even when there's economic hardship or people disagreeing with the government.
It's amazing how those internal political things can impact international relations. It's like a giant chess game where the players are motivated by so many things: ambition, national interests, and what's happening back home.
Exactly. And it reminds us that foreign policy decisions are never made in isolation. There's always this domestic context, political calculations, and internal dynamics that can really shape the course of events.
It makes you wonder, though, about any peace agreement that gets made under these circumstances.
Right.
If it's more about politics than a genuine desire for peace, can it really last?
That's a really important question. Any lasting solution has to address the root causes, not just the political needs of the leaders.
Yeah.
It has to involve real diplomacy, compromise, and understanding each other's security concerns.
And shouldn't it involve the Ukrainian people, too? I mean, they're the ones caught in the middle of all this.
Absolutely. They're bearing the brunt of this conflict, and their voices need to be heard in any discussions about their country's future.
Okay, so we've talked about history, we've talked about domestic politics. But what about the future? What are some of the possible scenarios we might see play out from here?
Well, predicting the future is always tough, especially in a situation this complex. But we can look at the trends, consider the different factors, and see a few possibilities emerge, each with its own consequences.
Okay, so let's start with the best case scenario. What would a good outcome look like here?
The ideal situation would be some kind of diplomatic breakthrough. Everyone comes back to the negotiating table, truly committed to finding a peaceful solution that respects everyone's interests.
So, picture this. The US, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe all sitting down together, ready for a real conversation and willing to compromise. What would that peace agreement even look like?
You would have to address Ukraine's security concerns, that's for sure.
Okay.
Guarantees about their territory, maybe some international peacekeeping force to prevent future aggression, and Russia would have to clearly commit to respecting Ukraine's sovereignty.
What about holding Russia accountable for what they've done? Could that be part of the deal?
That's a tricky one. If they demand too much from Russia, they might not even come to the table. But ignoring what's happened sends a dangerous message, like aggression gets a free pass.
So finding the right balance between accountability and compromise, that's key for any successful negotiation.
It is. It requires careful diplomacy, recognizing the need for justice, but also leaving space for reconciliation and a more stable future.
Okay, so that's the optimistic view. But let's be real, things don't always work out that way. What's the worst case scenario? What if diplomacy just fails completely?
The most worrying possibility is a full-blown escalation of the conflict.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the U.S. pulls back, Russia sees an opportunity, launches a huge offensive, and NATO gets dragged into the fighting. That could easily turn into a wider European war with catastrophic consequences for everyone.
That's a scary thought. And it's not just about the war itself, right? There's the long-term fallout to think about.
Exactly. A major war in Europe would impact the whole world.
Yeah.
Think about the economic crash, disrupted energy markets, millions of people displaced, and the risk of starting a whole new Cold War. Those are scenarios we definitely want to avoid.
Absolutely. So we've got best case, worst case.
Right.
But what's the most likely outcome, given where things stand now, something in between those extremes?
Honestly, the most likely scenario is a long, drawn-out stalemate. Neither side wins decisively. The conflict just drags on and on. More suffering, more instability, and a constant drain on everyone's resources.
So basically more of the same, but worse.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's a very real possibility. We need to be prepared for it.
This is all pretty heavy stuff. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they try to make sense of all this?
I think the most important thing is to remember how fluid and unpredictable this situation is. There are so many factors involved that it's impossible to say for sure what will happen.
So stay informed, pay attention, and try to understand the complexity of it all.
Exactly. Don't settle for easy answers or oversimplified narratives. Look for different perspectives, do your research, and be ready for things to change quickly.
It's like watching a high-stakes poker game, but we can only see some of the cards.
That's a great analogy. It reminds us to be careful about making predictions or jumping to conclusions. Things can shift rapidly. We need to be flexible in our thinking.
So what should we be watching for in the coming weeks and months? What are the clues that might tell us which way this is going?
Pay attention to the diplomatic efforts. Is there any progress towards an agreement? Are the key players actually talking to each other in good faith?
Okay, so diplomacy is one thing to watch. What else?
The military situation, of course. Is the fighting escalating or de-escalating? Are there any major territorial changes happening?
Right, those military developments could tell us a lot. What's the third thing to keep an eye on?
The internal politics in both the U.S. and Russia. What's the public opinion about the war? Are people starting to speak out against it? Is there any sign of instability?
Because those domestic pressures, they could really push Trump and Putin in certain directions. It's all connected.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to look at this holistically, consider all the different angles, and avoid jumping to conclusions.
This has been incredibly insightful. Thanks for walking us through all of this.
It's been my pleasure.
But before we move on, I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier. You said there might be some cracks in Putin's hold on power.
Right.
Can you tell us more about that? What makes you think his position might be weakening?
Well, like I said, there's growing discontent among Russians about the economy, the corruption, the lack of freedom.
So those are the things that could potentially lead to a change in leadership.
They could, yes. And we are starting to see that discontent come out in the open a bit more.
Really?
There have been protests in some Russian cities, and there's more criticism of Putin in the media, even in the state-controlled outlets.
Wow, that's pretty significant. So is it possible that Putin's grip on power isn't as strong as it used to be?
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
But we have to remember, he still controls the government, and he's shown he's willing to be ruthless to silence any opposition.
So it's a delicate situation, to say the least.
Very much so. And it's something we need to watch closely. What happens with this crisis in Ukraine? It could have a huge impact on Russia's future and on the balance of power in the world.
This deep dive has been incredibly informative. I feel like we've learned a lot and gotten much better understanding of just how complex this all is.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, in a world overflowing with information, critical thinking and being open to different viewpoints are more important than ever.
Wise words. But before we get too philosophical, I think there's one more aspect of this story we need to explore. The potential long-term consequences of these different scenarios we've been talking about.
You're right. It's not enough to analyze what's happening right now. We have to think about the future, what it means for Ukraine, the region, and the whole world.
Okay, so let's try to look ahead, put on our prediction hats, and see what we can see in the crystal ball. What are the potential long-term ramifications of this conflict for Ukraine and for the global order?
That's a great question, one that forces us to look beyond the headlines, to the bigger historical and geopolitical picture. How this crisis ends could have a huge impact on international relations for years to come.
All right, let's break it down. What are the key things to consider as we try to imagine the long-term consequences? All right, so we're really stepping into the what-if territory now. Like, what happens next? What are the long-term consequences of all this for Ukraine?
Well, we got to think about Ukraine itself, first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this war has been brutal, right? So many lives lost, their economy's a mess, the whole country's just been through the ringer. What happens now, it'll determine whether they can come out of this as a strong, independent nation, or if they end up weak and vulnerable, caught in the middle of these global power struggles.
Yeah, it's a make-or-break moment for them, for sure. But let's zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture. How does this whole situation impact the region, like Europe as a whole?
Okay, so imagine this. If they can actually find a resolution, something that really brings peace back to Ukraine and sticks this time, it could actually have a positive effect on the U.S. and Europe. Their alliance gets stronger. Everyone in the region feels a bit safer, right?
Okay, yeah, that's the optimistic take. But what if, and I hate to even say it, but what if things get worse? Like the conflict escalates or just drags on for years. What happens to Europe then?
That's when we got to worry. We could see a huge spike in tension between Russia and the West. Maybe even a new arms race starts up. And then the risk of another war breaking out in Europe with all the destruction that comes with it, that goes way up. And it's not just about fighting either. Think about the refugee crisis, economic chaos, the whole region becoming unstable.
It's a pretty grim picture, and it really brings it home that this isn't some far-off conflict we can just ignore. What happens in Ukraine affects everyone, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's a test case for the whole international system. The rules that are supposed to stop countries from just taking what they want by force. It really shows how fragile peace is, even now.
So as we wrap up, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember? What should they be thinking about as they watch all of this play out?
The most important thing to remember is this. Nothing is set in stone. We can analyze, we can guess, but there are so many factors in play, both internationally and within each country, that no one knows for sure what'll happen.
So no easy answers, huh?
Nope, definitely not. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, but don't rely on just one source. Get different perspectives, look deeper, and be ready for the situation to change quickly.
It's like trying to predict the weather, but with way higher stakes.
Exactly. This isn't just about politics or military strategy. It's about people's lives, and the kind of world we all want to live in. The choices made now by leaders and everyday people, they'll have consequences that last for generations. So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep thinking critically about everything you hear.
Great advice. Thanks for taking us through this. It's been a really eye-opening deep dive. And to our listeners, until next time, keep on exploring, keep on learning.
Oscast.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Oscast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.